she was publicly shamed as unmarriageable in front of the entire elite. But Lord Cornelius Adams, the richest, most ruthless man in London, saw her, truly saw her, and knelt before her before the music even stopped. Why would the Titan of London want a discarded spinster? The morning light that filtered into the cramped attic of Davies Hall was thin and judgmental. Rosalind Davies awoke to its cold touch, blinking at the dust motes dancing in the only luxury she possessed, a sliver of sun. She rose, her body aching from the thing mattress that did little to ward off the Mayfair chill. In the corner, a fractured mirror split her reflection into jagged fragments. She studied herself with detached precision. 25 years old. Her auburn hair, once her father's pride, now seemed merely a burden. Unmarriageable, they called her. The word had been carved into her soul by Lavinia's constant sneers. Below, the house stirred with the clatter of fine-boned china and Lavinia's bright, careless laughter. Descending the servants' stairs, Rosalind entered the golden light of the main breakfast room. "There you are," the Davies matriarch said coldly, not looking up from her silk. "The tea is tepid. Fetch a fresh pot." "Honestly, Rosalind," Lavinia giggled, "you move like a specter, though I suppose at your age one becomes practically invisible." Rosalind remained silent, unaware that by tonight the richest man in the empire would make her the most visible woman in London. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of Victorian stories, please like and subscribe for more stories of longing and history. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love reading your notes. Rosalind stood before the fractured mirror in her attic room, preparing for what she believed would be her final appearance in London society. The emerald velvet gown draped across her narrow bed was the last vestige of her father's love, commissioned before his death 3 years prior. She'd tried to sell it twice, but Lavinia had intervened each time, claiming it would reflect poorly on the family if their charity case was seen hawking goods like a common peddler. Her fingers traced the intricate lacework along the bodice. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the color chosen specifically to complement her auburn hair and green eyes. Yet as she looked at her reflection, all she could see were the flaws Lavinia had so carefully catalogued over the years. The slight asymmetry of her eyebrows, the freckles across her nose that refused to fade despite lemon treatments, the way her collarbone protruded too sharply, evidence of too many meals skipped so Lavinia could have second handings. "You're staring at yourself like a market goose inspecting the butcher's block," came Lavinia's voice from the doorway. Rosalind hadn't heard her approach. Her stepsister swept into the cramped space, her own gown of champagne silk rustling with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her worth. Though I suppose the comparison is apt, both past their prime and destined for the scrap heap. Rosalind said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence was her only armor against Lavinia's cruelty. "The Pembroke ball tonight will be quite the spectacle," Lavinia continued, circling Rosalind like a predator assessing prey. "Lady Pembroke has invited every eligible bachelor in London. Lord Ashford, the Duke of Thornbury, even the mysterious Lord Cornelius Adams, though he never dances." She paused, meeting Rosalind's eyes in the fractured mirror. "Of course, none of them will look at you. 3 seasons, Rosalind, 3 failures. Do you know what the Ton calls a woman who can't secure a match after 3 seasons?" "I know what they call me," Rosalind whispered. "Then wear it like the badge it is," Lavinia said, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "Tonight, I want you visible. I want you standing where everyone can see exactly what happens to girls who waste their youth on foolish dreams. Your failure makes my success all the more dazzling." It hadn't always been this way. Rosalind could still remember a time when Davies Hall had rung with her father's laughter, when the morning room had been filled with light and warmth, and the smell of her mother's rose garden drifting through open windows. But her mother had died when Rosalind was 12, and the Davies patriarch, lost in his grief, had remarried within a year. The Davies matriarch arrived like winter itself, bringing with her a daughter from her first marriage. Lavinia had been 15 then, already beautiful in that calculated way that turned heads and emptied purses. She had assessed Rosalind with cool appraisal and apparently found her wanting, for from that day forward Rosalind had been slowly, methodically erased from her own home. It started small. Lavinia would borrow Rosalind's ribbons and return them torn. She would whisper to their father that Rosalind had been rude to the servants, had spent too much on fabric, had been seen walking unchaperoned in the park. The Davies patriarch, already fragile, believed his new wife's daughter over his own flesh and blood. Rosalind's allowance was reduced, then eliminated. Her rooms were moved from the second floor to the attic. Her invitations to social events came later and later, until she had to beg Lavinia for hand-me-bound cards. When the Davies patriarch died, the will had been clear. The estate was to be managed by the Davies matriarch until Lavinia married, at which point it would pass to Lavinia's husband. Rosalind would receive a modest dowry, enough for a comfortable marriage to a country gentleman, but only if she married before her 26th birthday. After that, the dowry would revert to the estate. Rosalind would turn 26 in 3 months. "It's almost poetic," the Davies matriarch had said when the solicitor finished reading the will. "Your father was always so concerned about you becoming a burden. Now he's ensured you'll have every motivation to find a husband quickly, or to accept your fate with grace." But Lavinia and her mother had made sure that finding a husband was impossible. They monitored every conversation Rosalind had at balls and soirees. Any gentleman who showed the slightest interest received a quiet word from Lavinia about Rosalind's difficult temperament, or her unfortunate health concerns, or her questionable breeding. 3 promising courtships had withered under Lavinia's poison, and now, entering her 4th season, Rosalind had no prospects at all. Tonight was meant to be her execution, not her debut. The carriage that carried them to Pembroke House was suffocating despite the cool evening air. Lavinia sat across from Rosalind, radiant in her champagne silk, while the Davies matriarch dozed between them, her bulk taking up most of the seat. Rosalind pressed herself against the window, watching the gas lamps of Mayfair blur past. "Remember," Lavinia said softly, so her mother wouldn't wake, "I want you to stay visible tonight. I want everyone to see you. I want them to count the seasons you failed. I want them to whisper about the Davies girl who couldn't catch a husband if he fell from the sky." Rosalind turned to look at her stepsister. In the flickering lamplight, Lavinia's beauty took on a sharp, crystalline quality, like ice that could cut skin. "Why do you hate me so much?" Rosalind asked. It was the first time she'd ever voiced the question aloud. Lavinia's smile was terrible. "Because you don't deserve to be happy, and yet some foolish part of you still hopes you might be. I'm simply correcting a cosmic error." Pembroke House blazed with light, a palace of marble and gold that dominated its corner of Mayfair like a crown jewel.
Carriages lined the street for blocks, disgorging London's elite in waves of silk and jewels and barely concealed ambition. Rosalind descended the carriage steps on trembling legs, acutely aware of the eyes that tracked her movement. She heard the whispers start immediately. "Is that the Davies girl? I thought she'd given up."
3 seasons, and not even a country vicar showed interest. Poor thing. Though at her age, can one really be surprised? The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from gilded ceilings. The walls were draped in cloth of gold, and the orchestra was positioned on a raised dais that made them look like angels descended to provide celestial music. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse roses and expensive perfume, and the musk of 100 ambitious bodies pressed too close together. Lavinia abandoned her immediately, gliding toward a cluster of young lords who straightened at her approach like flowers turning towards the sun. The Davies matriarch found her friends, matrons in dark silks who wielded gossip like weapons. Rosalind was left alone in the center of the ballroom, an island of emerald velvet in a sea of judgment. If you can't stand people who deliberately isolate and humiliate others, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type "Nobody deserves that," because what happened next only got worse.
For an hour, Rosalind existed in a state of careful invisibility. She positioned herself near the refreshment table, nursed a glass of lemonade that had gone warm in her hand, and watched the dancers spin past in blurs of color and light. She had perfected this art over 3 seasons: how to be present without being noticed, how to fulfill Lavinia's requirement that she be visible while still protecting herself from the worst of the whispers. But Lavinia had other plans. "Rosalind!" Her stepsister's voice rang out across the ballroom, bright and false as fool's gold. "There you are! I've been looking everywhere for you." Rosalind's stomach dropped. She knew that tone. It was the voice Lavinia used when she was about to strike. Lavinia approached with a cluster of young men in her wake: Lord Ashford, the Duke of Thornbury, Viscount Blackwood, and several others whose names Rosalind couldn't recall through the sudden roar of panic in her ears. They were the season's most eligible bachelors, and they looked at Rosalind with expressions ranging from polite confusion to barely disguised amusement. "Gentlemen," she said, her smile dazzling, "I wanted to introduce you to my dear stepsister, Rosalind. She's been on the marriage mart for quite some time now, and I thought perhaps you might offer her some advice on how to finally secure a match." The cruelty of it stole Rosalind's breath. Lord Ashford had the grace to look uncomfortable, but the Duke of Thornbury laughed outright. "Advice?" he said. "My dear Miss Davies, the only advice I could offer is that perhaps you've set your standards too high. A woman of your vintage should perhaps consider country parsons or widowers in need of housekeepers."
The circle of men laughed. Rosalind felt her face burn, felt the attention of the entire ballroom shift toward this little tableau of humiliation. The orchestra continued to play, but the music seemed to come from very far away. "Oh, I think Rosalind's standards are quite reasonable," Lavinia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's simply that she's become, well, there's no kind way to say it." She paused, letting the tension build, letting every eye in the ballroom focus on this moment. "She's become unmarriageable." The word dropped into the ballroom like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and delighted scandal in every direction. Rosalind heard the gasps, the quickly muffled laughter, the whispers that spread like wildfire. Unmarriageable.
It was the worst thing you could call a woman in the ton, a social death sentence. To say it aloud, in public, at the season's most prestigious ball, was an act of such calculated cruelty that even Lavinia's circle of suitors looked shocked. "Lavinia," Lord Ashford said quietly, "that's rather honest," Lavinia interrupted. "I thought it was time someone told her the truth. 4 seasons, gentlemen, 4 seasons of failure. At some point one must accept reality." Rosalind stood frozen, unable to move or speak or even breathe. The ballroom spun around her, a kaleidoscope of pitying faces and delighted gossips. This was it. This was the end Lavinia had been engineering for years. She would leave Pembroke House tonight with her reputation in tatters, unmarriageable in truth as well as rumor. The small dowry she might have used to secure a modest country marriage would mean nothing now. No one would want the woman who had been publicly branded as unworthy. And then the sound stopped. Not the gradual ending of a waltz, but an abrupt cessation that left the ballroom in shocking silence. The conductor's baton hung suspended in midair. The dancers froze in place. Even the servants stopped moving, their trays of champagne glasses held aloft like offerings to a suddenly attentive god. Into this silence came the sound of footsteps. Heavy boots on marble, each step echoing through the ballroom with the inevitability of a heartbeat. Rosalind looked up through tear-blurred eyes and saw the crowd parting like water before a ship's prow. He was a study in darkness and power. Lord Cornelius Adams, the Titan of London, the man who owned half the city's banks and all of its most profitable shipping lines, strode through the ballroom with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face all sharp angles and aristocratic bone structure. His evening clothes were immaculate, black on black on black. And his eyes were fixed on Rosalind with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Unmarriageable," he said, and his voice carried through the silent ballroom like a judgment. What an extraordinary word to use for the most remarkable woman in London.
Rosalind had never been this close to Lord Cornelius Adams before. She had seen him, of course, at other events over the years. He was impossible to miss, a dark figure who stood at the edges of ballrooms and watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a man observing insects under glass. He never danced. He never courted. He had been a fixture of London society for nearly a decade, growing wealthier and more powerful with each passing year, and in all that time he had shown interest in precisely no one. Until now. He stopped in front of Lavinia's circle of suitors, and they scattered like children caught stealing sweets. The Duke of Thornbury actually stumbled backward, his face gone pale. Lord Ashford bowed hastily and retreated. Within seconds, only Lavinia, Rosalind, and Lord Cornelius remained in the center of the ballroom, with 500 pairs of eyes watching their every move. "Lord Adams?" Lavinia said, her voice suddenly uncertain. "What an unexpected pleasure. I was just—" "You were just demonstrating the very worst qualities of the ton. Cruelty disguised as honesty, ambition dressed up as concern. You sought to destroy your stepsister's reputation to enhance your own, as if tearing down another woman could somehow make you more worthy of admiration." He paused, his gaze raking over Lavinia with open contempt. "It doesn't. It makes you small." Rosalind's face went through a remarkable transformation, shock, then rage,
Then fear, as she realized she was facing a man who could destroy her social standing with a single word. "I was merely stating facts." "You were stating lies, and I have grown tired of listening to them." He turned away from Lavinia as if she had ceased to exist, and his attention settled fully on Rosalind. She stood transfixed, unable to look away from those dark eyes, unable to process what was happening. The most powerful man in London was defending her. The Titan of London, who had ignored every debutante and heiress and social climber for years, was looking at her as if she were the only person in the world who mattered. "Miss Davies," he said, and his voice had changed, gone soft in a way that made something warm unfurl in her chest. "I apologize for the delay. I should have done this years ago." And then Lord Cornelius Adams, master of merchant fleets and banking empires, the man whose word could topple governments and launch fortunes, dropped to one knee on the polished marble floor of Pembroke House. If you believe true worth comes from character, not cruelty, hit that subscribe button. People like Lavinia won't, and you need to hear what he said next. The ballroom held its collective breath. Rosalind heard someone faint in the back of the crowd, heard Lady Pembroke make a small sound of shock, heard the Davies matriarch's teacup shatter on the floor. But all of that seemed to come from very far away, because her entire world had narrowed to the man kneeling before her. "Miss Rosalind Davies," Cornelius said, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom with perfect clarity. "I have spent 3 seasons watching you navigate this cesspool of social ambition with more grace and dignity than anyone here deserves. I have watched you be diminished and dismissed and treated as less than you are by people who wouldn't recognize true value if it was presented to them on a silver platter. I have watched you survive cruelty that would have broken lesser souls, and I have watched you remain kind despite every reason to become bitter." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, the diamond inside caught the light from 1,000 candles and sent rainbows dancing across the ballroom ceiling. It was enormous, easily 10 carats, set in a band of platinum that had been worked into an intricate design of vines and roses. "I am not a man who speaks in flowery phrases or makes grand romantic gestures. I am a businessman. I deal in facts and figures and concrete realities. So here are the facts. You are the most intelligent, resilient, and genuinely beautiful woman I have ever encountered. You possess a strength that has nothing to do with social standing and everything to do with character. And I have been in love with you since the first moment I saw you refuse to laugh at someone else's misfortune at the Rothschild ball 3 years ago." Rosalind couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mind was a blank slate of shock, unable to process the impossible scene unfolding before her. "I am offering you more than a proposal of marriage. I am offering you an empire. My shipping lines, my banks, my estates in 3 countries, all of it will be yours. I am offering you a seat at every table that has ever closed its doors to you. I am offering you the power to remake London society according to your own vision of what it should be. And, most importantly, I am offering you freedom. Freedom from people who sought to break you, freedom to become whoever you wish to become." He held up the ring, and it caught the light like a star. "Rosalind Davies, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The silence stretched. Rosalind looked down at this man, this impossibly powerful, impossibly wealthy man, kneeling before her with an expression of such open vulnerability that it made her heart ache. Around them, the ballroom waited. She could see Lavinia's face gone white with shock and rage. She could see the Davies matriarch, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. She could see 500 members of the ton, all of them witnessing the impossible. The Titan of London proposing to the woman they had called unmarriageable not 5 minutes before. Rosalind realized in that crystalline moment that she had a choice. She could refuse, could walk away from this fairy tale, could return to her attic room in her life of quiet desperation. Or she could choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about everything. Wrong about her worth, wrong about her beauty, wrong about the impossibility of happiness. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, strong enough to be heard throughout the ballroom. "Yes, Lord Adams, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted. Applause and shocked exclamations and the buzz of 1,000 conversations starting at once filled the air. But Rosalind heard none of it, because Cornelius had risen to his feet, had taken her hand in his, had slipped that enormous ring onto her finger with a gentleness that made tears spring to her eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, so only she could hear. "You have made me the happiest man in England."
Lavinia recovered first. She always did. Her face had gone from white to red, and she pushed through the crowd with all the fury of someone watching their carefully constructed plans crumble to dust. "This is ridiculous," she spat, her voice shrill enough to cut through the celebration. "Lord Adams, surely you're not serious. Rosalind she's nothing. She has no dowry, no connections, no—" "She has herself," Cornelius said, his voice cold as winter, "which is more than can be said for you, Miss Lavinia Davies. You have a pretty face purchased with someone else's money, a cruel tongue, and a soul as shallow as a puddle. I wouldn't marry you if you were the last woman in England." The ballroom gasped. To insult a lady so directly in public was beyond scandalous, but Cornelius wasn't finished. "In fact," he continued, turning to address the crowd, "I want everyone here to understand exactly what kind of woman Miss Lavinia Davies truly is. For 3 years, she has systematically destroyed her stepsister's reputation. She has spread lies about Miss Rosalind's character, her health, her virtue. She has sabotaged every courtship, poisoned every potential connection, all to ensure that she would shine brighter by comparison. She has treated a woman who should have been her sister with a cruelty that would make tyrants blush." He paused, letting his words sink in. Rosalind could see faces in the crowd changing, see the realization dawning. Lady Pembroke was whispering urgently to her companions. The Duchess of Fairfax looked horrified. The men who had been circling Lavinia all season were backing away as if from a diseased animal.
"I am the wealthiest man in this room," Cornelius said. "Probably the wealthiest man in England. I could buy and sell every family here 10 times over. And I am using that wealth and that power to ensure that Miss Lavinia Davies never sets foot in polite society again. Any family who receives her will find their credit cut off. Any business that employs her connections will find their contracts canceled. Any man who courts her will find himself mysteriously unable to secure loans or investments. She sought to make her stepsister unmarriageable. Instead, she has made herself untouchable. Lavinia's face had gone from red to gray. She swayed on her feet, and for a moment Rosalind thought she might faint. The Davies matriarch was pushing through the crowd, her face thunderous. But even she seemed to realize there was nothing she could say, no argument she could make that would change what had just happened. "You'll regret this," Lavinia hissed at Rosalind, her voice low and venomous. "Both of you. I'll find a way to—" "You'll do nothing," Cornelius said flatly. "Because if you try, I will personally ensure that you and your mother spend the rest of your lives in debtor's prison. The Davies estate is mortgaged to one of my banks, Miss Lavinia. Did you not know? I've owned your home for the past 6 months. I could have you both out on the street by morning if I chose." It was a lie, or at least Rosalind thought it might be. But it didn't matter, because Lavinia believed it. She could see the belief and the fear wash over her stepsister like a wave. Lavinia turned and fled, pushing through the crowd with her mother huffing behind her. The last Rosalind saw of them were 2 figures in expensive silk, running from Pembroke House as if the very devil was at their heels. Perhaps he was.
"I believe," Cornelius said, turning back to Rosalind with a softness that seemed impossible in a man who had just delivered such devastating condemnation, "that this is the part where I ask you to dance." The orchestra, which had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly remembered their purpose. The conductor raised his baton, and the opening strains of a waltz filled the ballroom. Cornelius offered his hand, and Rosalind took it, feeling the strength in his fingers, the warmth of his palm against hers. He led her to the center of the floor, and the crowd parted to give them space. As he placed one hand at her waist and raised their joined hands to the proper position, Rosalind finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me? You could have anyone. You could have had any of the diamond debutantes, any of the wealthy heiresses. Why choose me?" Cornelius smiled, and it transformed his face from austere to almost boyish. "Do you remember the Rothschild ball 3 years ago, your first season?" Rosalind shook her head. There had been so many balls, so many nights of humiliation. Lady Rothschild had invited a young woman from the country, a merchant's daughter who had recently come into money. The ton was circling her like sharks, mocking her accent, her dress, her manners. You were the only one who spoke to her kindly. You spent the entire evening teaching her which fork to use, which dances were appropriate, how to navigate the complex rules of society. I watched you give up your own evening, your own chance to make connections, to help someone who had no connection to you at all.
He spun her gently, and she followed his lead with surprising ease. She had never been an exceptional dancer. Lavinia had always stolen the instruction time with the dancing master, but with Cornelius, it felt natural. "That's when I knew," he continued. "That's when I realized you were different. You have kindness in a world that rewards cruelty. You have integrity in a society built on lies. You have genuine beauty, the kind that comes from within and radiates outward, not the false prettiness of powder and paint." "But you never spoke to me," Rosalind said. "In 3 years, you never even looked at me." "I looked at you constantly," Cornelius said. "I watched you at every ball, every soiree, every social event. I saw how you retreated, how you bore it with grace. I saw your stepsister's cruelty and your own resilience. I wanted to intervene 100 times, but I needed to be sure. I needed to know that you would choose me for myself, not for my money or my power. I needed to know that you could survive the worst the ton could offer and still remain yourself." The waltz parried them across the floor, and Rosalind realized that every eye in the ballroom was still fixed on them. But for the first time in her life, the attention didn't feel like judgment. It felt like witness. These people were watching her transformation from discarded spinster to the most enviable woman in London. "I was also," Cornelius admitted, his voice dropping to a murmur only she could hear, "quite terrified, Miss Davies. I have built empires, Miss Davies. I have negotiated with kings and bankrupted rivals without breaking a sweat. But the thought of approaching you, of risking rejection from the one person whose opinion truly mattered, that terrified me beyond reason. I am, it turns out, a coward when it comes to matters of the heart."
Rosalind laughed, and it surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed with genuine joy. "You just destroyed my stepsister's entire future in front of 500 people. You don't seem very cowardly to me." "Ah," Cornelius said, his eyes twinkling. "But that was easy. That was simply business. This," he gestured between them, "this is far more dangerous. This requires vulnerability." The music swelled toward its conclusion, and Cornelius pulled her closer than propriety strictly allowed. "I have one more confession," he said. "The ring belonged to my grandmother. She was the daughter of a Russian count who lost everything in a revolution and had to flee to England with only the jewels she could carry. She rebuilt her life from nothing, married my grandfather, and helped him build the fortune I inherited. Before she died, she made me promise that I would only give this ring to a woman who understood what it meant to be strong in the face of adversity, a woman who knew what it was to lose everything and still retain her humanity." Tears pricked at Rosalind's eyes. "I'm honored," she whispered. "The honor," Cornelius said, "is entirely mine." The carriage that carried them away from Pembroke House was nothing like the cramped vehicle Rosalind had arrived in. This was Cornelius's private coach, upholstered in velvet the color of midnight, with brass fittings that gleamed in the lamplight. A coat of arms was painted on the door, and a matched team of 4 black horses pulled them through the streets of Mayfair at a leisurely pace. "Where are we going?" Rosalind asked. She was acutely aware that she was alone with a man in a carriage, that propriety dictated she should have a chaperone, that she should be worried about her reputation. But after what happened tonight, the old rules seemed laughably inadequate. "To Davies Hall," Cornelius said, "to collect your belongings. You won't be staying in that attic another night." Rosalind's breath caught. "But Lavinia and her mother are no longer your concern," Cornelius said firmly. "I meant what I said about owning the mortgage on the estate. Well, it wasn't entirely accurate. I didn't own it this morning, but I made a few inquiries during the ball, and as of an hour ago, I now hold the deed to Davies Hall. Your stepsister and her mother may remain in residence for precisely 1 month, during which time they will find alternative housing. After that, the house becomes ours." "Ours?" Rosalind echoed. "Yours," Cornelius corrected. "I'll have the deed transferred to your name as a wedding gift. It was your father's house, after all. It should have been yours from the beginning." The carriage stopped in front of Davies Hall, and Cornelius helped her down. The house looked different now, smaller somehow, its grandeur revealed as shabby gentility. Rosalind walked up the steps with Cornelius at her side, and when she pushed open the door, she found Lavinia and the Davies matriarch waiting in the foyer. "You have to help us," Lavinia said, and Rosalind was shocked to see tears on her stepsister's face.
Please, Rosalind, I know I was cruel. I know I was wrong. But you can't let him destroy us. We're family." "We were never family," Rosalind said, and her voice was steady. "Family doesn't tear each other down. Family doesn't steal and scheme and systematically destroy hope. You made my life a living hell for years, Lavinia. You called me unmarriageable. You tried to ensure I would die alone and forgotten." "I was jealous," Lavinia cried. "You don't understand. You've always been the pretty one, the one father loved, the one who got everything without trying. I had to fight for every scrap of attention, every—" "That's not true," Rosalind interrupted. "My father loved you. He welcomed you into his home, treated you as his own daughter. And you repaid that love by stealing my inheritance and trying to break my spirit. Whatever jealousy you felt, it didn't justify what you did." The Davies matriarch stepped forward, her face hard. "So what now? You're going to throw us out onto the street? You're going to abandon us to poverty? That's not very Christian of you, Rosalind." Cornelius made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You have a great deal of audacity, madam, lecturing anyone about Christian behavior. But Miss Davies is a better person than either of you deserve. You will have 1 month to find new accommodations. I will provide a modest allowance, enough to rent a small house in an unfashionable part of town. You will not be destitute, but neither will you ever return to society. Consider it mercy, because mercy is more than you showed my fiancé." Rosalind climbed the stairs to her attic room one last time. She gathered the few possessions she truly valued: her mother's jewelry box, her father's pocket watch, the books she had managed to save from Lavinia's periodic purges. Everything else, the worn dresses, the patched shoes, the threadbare linens, she left behind. They were artifacts of a life she no longer needed to live. When she descended the stairs, Cornelius was waiting. He had dismissed Lavinia and her mother to their rooms, and the house was quiet. He held out his hand, and Rosalind took it.
"Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. They walked out of Davies Hall together, and Rosalind didn't look back. The carriage took her to Cornelius's townhouse in Grosvenor Square, a mansion that made Davies Hall look like a cottage. Servants appeared to take Rosalind's meager bundle of possessions, and a housekeeper in immaculate black showed her to a suite of rooms that took her breath away. "These will be yours until the wedding. Lord Adams thought you might prefer the east wing. It gets the best morning light. The dressing room is through there, and the private sitting room is beyond that. If you need anything at all, simply ring." After the housekeeper left, Rosalind stood in the center of her new bedroom and slowly turned in a circle. The bed was easily 3 times the size of her narrow attic cot. The furniture was mahogany and gleamed with polish. The windows overlooked a private garden that was still green despite the late season. It was luxury beyond anything she had imagined. There was a knock at the door, and Cornelius entered at her invitation. He had removed his jacket and waistcoat, and in his shirt sleeves he looked younger, more approachable. "I wanted to make sure you were settled, and to tell you that you don't have to go through with this if you don't want to. I know tonight was overwhelming. I know I more or less ambushed you with that proposal. If you need time, if you want to back out, I would understand." Rosalind crossed the room to stand in front of him. She reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone. He stood perfectly still, barely breathing, as if any movement might shatter the moment. "I spent 3 years believing I was worthless," she said softly. "I spent 3 years letting other people define my value. But tonight, you showed me something I had forgotten, that I get to choose my own worth,
that I get to decide who I want to be and what I want to accept. And I choose this. I choose you. Not because of your wealth or your power, but because in a room full of people who saw me as a failure, you saw me as someone worth fighting for.
Cornelius closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears. I will spend every day of our lives together making sure you never forget your worth again, he said. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, a promise sealed without words. When he finally pulled away, he was smiling. "Welcome home, Rosalind," he said. And standing in that beautiful room, wearing a ring that had belonged to a woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes, Rosalind realized that that was exactly what she had found. Not just a home, but herself. Not just a husband, but freedom. Not just an escape from Lavinia's cruelty, but a throne of her own making. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you are watching this from. Represent your country. The next morning, all of London would wake to the news that the Titan of London had found his bride. Mothers would wail that they had overlooked the Davies girl. Debutantes would study Rosalind's every move, trying to understand what had attracted such a prize. Lavinia would pack her bags and disappear into obscurity, a cautionary tale about the dangers of cruelty. But Rosalind wouldn't care about any of that, because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that being unmarriageable to the wrong people was actually the highest compliment, that true worth wasn't measured in successful seasons or advantageous matches, but in the strength to remain kind in a cruel world. She was no longer the discarded sister in the attic. She was Lady Rosalind Adams, future wife to the richest man in England, mistress of an empire, and most importantly, a woman who had finally remembered how to value herself. And if the ton didn't like it, well, they could take it up with her husband.